Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Pereira. China plans to increase the size of its Marine Corps from about 20,000 to about 1 lakh personnel to protect the nation's maritime lifelines and its growing interests overseas. Some members would be stationed at ports China operates in Djibouti, in the Horn of Africa, and Gwadar in southwest Pakistan. Now, the expanded corps is part of a wider push to refocus the world's largest army away from winning a land war based on sheer numbers and towards meeting a range of security scenarios using highly specialized units. Towards that end, Chinese President Xi Jinping is reducing the size of the People's Liberation Army by 300,000, with nearly all of the cuts coming from the land forces. On this edition of The Big Picture, we look at the ramifications of this move and how it will upset the balance of power in the Indian Ocean. Joining me on the program today are Raviprasad Narayanan, Associate Professor, Center for East Asian Studies, JNU, retired Commodore C. Uday, Bhaskar, Director, Society for Policy Studies, Pramit Chaudhuri, Foreign Editor, Hindustan Times, and Shashank, former Foreign Secretary. Commodore, I'd like to begin with you, of course. What do you make of this latest development?
I would say this development is reflective of President Xi Jinping's determination to give China the appropriate maritime/naval footprint as also muscle in the extended Indian Ocean region. Because as you rightly observed in your opening remarks, China is now signaling that it's going to increase the size of its Marine Corps from 20,000 by fivefold to almost 1 lakh personnel. It will take time, but you can see the way in which China is now moving, because it's very clear if you look at the events of the last decade, going back to the piracy attack 2008 onwards to where we are now, that at sea there would be the need for a major country like China, trade, energy, etc., to have robust special forces capability. That's what I think this Marine Force is going to be all about. And clearly, if China is committing almost $46 billion, as has been announced, as far as the one road, one belt is concerned, they would need an appropriate force. In this case, they are looking at the Marines, as they are calling them, to protect Chinese assets in the event of any exigency. My immediate reading is that this is a long-term plan for exigencies that may come up, particularly in relation to Gwadar and Balochistan, because the other parts of the IOR are relatively stable, or the countries in question are able to enforce that minimum degree of stability that major trading nations are looking for when it comes to the sea lines of communication.
Indeed, Pramit, as Commodore is just suggesting, it certainly looks like it's a long-term plan. But is it a plan that is going to be limited to the Indian Ocean, or is China even looking at maybe forays into the Pacific?
Oh, it's definitely, I think, the bulk of it will be aimed at the defense of the Pacific. The point is that China used to have a Marine Corps, a much larger one. Up to 1957, the PLA Marine Corps was actually over 120,000 strong. And the primary purpose of it, however, was the conquest of Taiwan. It was designed to launch an amphibious attack on Taiwan and conquer Taiwan, or support an attack, an aerial attack on Taiwan. In 1957, when basically they decided that they would never actually be able to conquer Taiwan, they gave up on that idea, and therefore the Marine Corps was then allowed to dwindle to roughly what it is now, just about 20,000 men. Now, the fact that they're reviving it fits in not just with their Indian Ocean strategy, but in fact really with their Pacific strategy, which is still the dominant, their dominant maritime security concern. And I think that the South China Sea is probably the primary target for this larger Marine Corps. You're going to be seeing if countries like if under the Trump administration, America decides to take a stronger posture in the South China Sea, and they'll have countries like Vietnam potentially to contend with.
The signal now that you brought up Trump, is this something that should concern Trump, this development?
Well, the fact is Trump has already announced he plans to add 35 battalions to the U.S. Marine Corps. So he will be adding that and adding 100,000 infantry to the U.S. Army. So he's already begun a military escalation, and all the evidence that we have, including the statements and articles by his own advisors, indicates that the primary purpose of all of this escalation is China. So in effect, you saw already in September when Trump announced his military modernization program on the campaign trail, and that he's now beginning the process of implementing, he'd already announced that America would reverse the sort of reduction in defense expenditure that Obama had initiated, and that the bulk of this would be aimed towards China. An additional 100 warships, for example, be added to the U.S. Navy. So China, I think, maybe in partly in response to America, but I think even if America hadn't done this, given China's problems, look at China has now opened up maritime disputes, territorial disputes, with virtually every country from Japan all the way down to the South China Sea. It has now an increased Indian Ocean presence. It argues in its PLA Navy white papers that China must defend the sea lanes of communication across the Indian Ocean. All of this requires both not only warships, but it also requires a Marine Corps to at least, even if you're not going to actually use it, the fact that it's there acts as a deterrent or as a warning to countries in the maritime sphere.
Indeed, fair enough. You know, Ambassador, should India be concerned at all at this development? Because India has some major, stakes in the Indian Ocean region and in the Indian Ocean, so this should certainly, raise some alarm bells maybe in India.
Well, India has treated the Indian Ocean as an ocean of peace and stability, and that is what it has been trying to do, to build up friendships, visits by our naval ships, and by training the port people, the naval people in many of these countries around the Indian Ocean. Now that China has decided that it is going to become one of the major global powers, and the Americans are increasing their, as Pramit has mentioned, Americans are increasing their power vis-a-vis Chinese, so China will go all out, and therefore we have cause to worry. First reason is that Chinese are coming into our neighborhood immediately. They know that there are a lot of terrorist elements there, and they cannot depend on the local governments to take care of these terrorists. So therefore they are doing 2-3 things. One is that they are negotiating with the terrorists themselves directly. They are also building up their own strength and requesting the local governments to provide greater security to the Chinese personnel working in these areas. So that is one area where. Second is that they are increasing trading posts all around the Indian Ocean and also developing or exploiting the mineral resources, oil resources, other resources in those areas. So they want to again increase their presence in these countries. So India has both a cooperative as well as a competitive relationship in many of these countries, because we have old friendships with the African countries, with the Southeast Asian countries, and they have a relationship of trust with India. But the Chinese said, okay, forget about trust and all that, but we have deep pockets and we are going to put a lot of money in your countries. So that also counts. Indeed. So therefore we have reason to worry, but at the same time we have to firstly plan our own immediate linkages, sea linkages and road linkages with our immediate neighboring countries. And around the Indian Ocean, if there are other countries who want help from us in training their navies, in getting more frequent visits from the Indian Navy, we should go ahead. And this piracy, etc., where we have cooperated with the Chinese also. So there is no, we must build up our strength further in containing piracy in the Indian Ocean.
Fair enough. Raviprasad, as far as China is concerned, the point that the ambassador raises is the fact that, the Chinese need to take security into their own hands because they are expanding. So is there anything wrong in, China really safeguarding its own interests? Is it just that, or is it, more, is there more to it than meets the eye?
I think these mutually complement each other. For instance, when China says it is to protect its own supply chains when it comes to trade, one has to go by that argument which they put forward. Second aspect is that trade in these contested waters always requires some sense of security, and which, if the PLA Navy is providing, that is worrisome to us, because we are geographical stakeholders to the region, while China could be interpreted as being an interloper. But from China's point of view, it is that they see a strategic vacuum in the whole region. They see a United States hobbled by its own domestic shortfalls the last 8 years plus, and they also see that this is an opportunity that shouldn't be missed. After all, the character for opportunity and threat are the same in Chinese. So they're trying to make the most of this situation, and also to prove that, I mean, if we insert ourselves into the equation, the question that arises is, what about the United Kingdom and the United States? Because ultimately China would want to outflank the US from the Indian Ocean. And these are incremental steps which they are taking. And Xi Jinping also is addressing the domestic audience because he's had a contested relationship with the PLA. I mean, the series of corruption scams that the PLA has been involved in, and he has come out trumps. So this is also a message that he is in control of everything that China does at this moment, and this is an opportunity that should not be missed, and hence the moves towards the Indian Ocean, whether it is setting up bases or increasing personnel. Although I must say that before the discussion, the panelists were just discussing as to the real numbers. I mean, 100,000 seems really huge to begin with. Is it actually 100,000 or is it much lesser to begin with? Because this calls for a huge logistic supply network which China has to put in place before you actually support these numbers. And where are the bases? So these are things which we have to watch.
Indeed, indeed. You know, talking about Xi Jinping, Commodore, do you believe that the Malacca Dilemma is really playing on the mind of Xi Jinping at this point in time?
Well, I would say that the Malacca Dilemma itself, which we ascribe to President Hu Jintao, is actually the foundation, is what you might call as China's very, very deep kind of awareness at the highest levels of the party and the Politburo that they need to have a very credible maritime presence. Let me summarize it in the following manner, Frank, that if you look at it historically over a 500-year timeline, every major power, you know, from Iberia downwards has always found it necessary to acquire appropriate maritime and naval capability. My reading is that somewhere in the 60s, under Chairman Mao, China realized that they need to have much greater levels of maritime capability than what they had at that time. And progressively, from Chairman Mao's time, where I think the first objective was China acquiring a nuclear propelled submarine, as also a ballistic missile that could be fired from a nuclear submarine. Then you come to the post-Tiananmen period, where you see under Deng Xiaoping and subsequently with Mr. Jiang Zemin, the focus on China's maritime infrastructure. They catch up with the Japanese in terms of shipbuilding, port infrastructure, and then you come to the Hu Jintao period, where the Malacca Dilemma is identified as one of the reasons for China to acquire credible maritime capability. And the big, I would say, significant cusp is when Chinese ships are able to enter the Indian Ocean as part of the piracy, shall we say, challenge, and that is the transition from Hu Jintao to Xi Jinping. And I would say, Frank, more than alarm for India about the Marines per se, there are many, I would say, higher defense management lessons for India. We are now in a period where we seem to have temporary defense ministers, and I say this with due respect, I'm on Rajya Sabha TV, that for whatever reasons, now we have Mr. Arun Jaitley, the finance minister, who has additional charge. This is not the first time he's had similar kind of responsibility, at a time when India has huge higher defense management challenges. Look at China. They have steadily and determinedly invested in the maritime domain, acquired credible capability. Now they are moving from maritime to cyber to space. They have deeper pockets, as Ambassador Shashank has pointed out, but more than that, it is the political resolve. And here we are looking at a country where, again, if you look at the news reports of last week, we have no minesweepers. Peninsular India with 14 major ports does not have adequate minesweeping capability, and this decision has been pending for more than 12 years. So to me, as a sailor, if I may say so, the real lessons are how do major countries ensure their comprehensive security, of which the maritime component is one part, and the Marines, if I may add, with great respect, are just one strand. So I think we should really look at this in terms of the big picture lessons. That is the focus of your program. It's the big picture. We should locate it in that appropriate manner.
Indeed, Frank. Indeed. Pramit, you know, Commodore is mentioning about the political will, you know, is that something that the Chinese have identified as well, and that's why they have decided to shift, you know, to strengthen their Marine Corps and you know, strengthen their Navy as such, and you know, bring about lesser dependence really on the army, because India is no longer a threat to the Chinese?
Well, I don't think they ever really saw India as much of a threat. I think for them, the real question, the threat for them was the United States. That is the only country that they have seen as being, if you wish, the only peer country that they needed to worry about. But if you look at the pattern of Chinese behavior since 2008 and 2009, when the financial crisis hit, they have become increasingly aggressive on the military side. They would make they always had a claim on Senkaku Islands, Diaoyu Islands against Japan, but they only began using aircraft and ships to push their position roughly after 2008, where you see a spike. And if you look at the border incidents with India, you also see a spike at the same time, 2008 to 2010. And so what you're seeing there is a sense, and when I've gone to China and I've gone to Japan and so on, it's very clear that both sides argue that basically the Chinese saw the financial crisis as the beginning of the decline of the United States, if you wish, as a military power, or at least a loss of will on the part of America to actually involve itself in these incidents. And this was exacerbated by the Obama administration's deep unwillingness to involve itself militarily in defending the South China Sea as an international water. So as a consequence, you start to see China become more and more aggressive and basically face very little resistance. At least for the first 3 or 4 years, there was nobody really, everybody's looking at Washington to respond. But what has happened now is inevitably is that after a while giving up on Washington, especially under Obama, you saw Japan has now began to massively rebuild its navy. Japan is remilitarizing at a very rapid pace and is now on its way, if it completes all of what it's proposed to do, will probably become one of the second, if not the most powerful Asian navy in our continent. India has begun to expand its naval as Chinese submarines have begun to enter the Indian Ocean. Countries like Vietnam, all across Southeast Asia, you see defense budgets slowly increasing in response to this Chinese aggression. So what we now have is essentially a vicious cycle in which these countries begin to expand their capacities, and as these territorial disputes remain completely unresolved and in fact get worse, then China now responds by expanding its own military capacity. And now the Americans with the new administration now declare that they're back in the game. And you look at Trump's announced, at least, increase in defense expenditures equal to just the increase is the size of China's entire defense budget.
Yes.
So it's enormous. It's going to take a 250 warship fleet to make it to 350 warships, and so on and so forth. So now you're starting to really get into an arms cycle, if you wish, in which not just a question of the number of weapons you have, but the capabilities that you now have to have. And this is now where the Marine is interesting, because look at it from a Chinese perspective. You have a Trump administration in which at least two people, the Secretary of State and the White House spokesperson, have both publicly said that we will consider the option of isolating and blockading military one of the South China Sea islets that the Chinese have taken over and built a military place on. If you're a Chinese general, you're now going to Xi Jinping and says, what is our response on this? America is militarily far superior to us in terms of air power and sea power, but their land power is still very far away.
Indeed.
So why don't we start to compensate on this side? We need to have the ability to be able to take them on, and even if we don't have that capacity, we do have to have capacity to take on this Vietnam in these areas. So across the board, you start to try to build more capacity. So you can see the submarines has become a very big issue in Asia now. Asian navies are adding submarines very rapidly because it's one of the best means by which you can respond to surface capacity, is to have underwater response. Second is the development of ship-killing missiles like the BrahMos cruise missile that we have, the Chinese DF-17, to take on a superior navy but use large missiles or long-range cruise missiles to take them out, which is why Vietnam has been begging India for the BrahMos, because they need a missile like that to take on the Chinese.
Indeed.
And then marine capacity, therefore, would be, I think, a logical step in all of this.
You know, talking about huge budgets, Ambassador, how do countries in the Far East and Southeast Asia really compete with someone like a China who has a huge defense budget, really? Of course, not as big as the US budget, but still big nonetheless.
You're quite right. I mean, the issue is that Chinese don't have to set up bases in many of the Southeast Asian countries. All that they have to do is to convince these countries that they can rely more on Chinese economic assistance and infrastructure related project assistance from Chinese. And immediately they are then quite soft in their positions towards the Chinese, because the Americans can never give them that kind of confidence that the Americans would be willing to take on the Chinese on behalf of any of these countries. And that has been the reason, as Pramit mentioned, that in Obama's time, the Filipinos were clearly quite cynical about any assistance coming from the Americans, and the Japanese also, though they don't talk like this, that they have been increasing their own power. The Koreans are quite worried on that score, that the Americans will be protecting their own people living in Asia, their own soldiers, rather than the local people. The second point arises that Americans are going to put a huge amount of money and focus in and around the South China Sea and the constructions which are being carried out by the Chinese. So Chinese would like to increase their presence in all those other countries which are softer targets from their point of view, and then they would try to enlarge the whole game for the Americans, so that the Americans or Indians or anyone else, if they are interested in playing this game, the Chinese with their deep pockets and with their friendships with so many countries and in various choke points, and they can jolly well increase their, let's say they can go to Gwadar, they can go to Sri Lanka, they can go to Myanmar, or many of the countries on the African continent, or islands in the Indian Ocean, etc., and similarly on the Pacific side. So they will perhaps keep on doing that, and they have the capability, they have the long-term kind of planning for this purpose. The Americans will have, because of their democracy, which of course is a rich democracy, unlike the Indians, which are poor, as well as a democratic state where policies keep on changing every 5 years or so. So the Chinese know how to deal with these kind of situations where their policies are made for at least 15 or 20 years on an incremental basis to know. And let us also see that the Americans themselves had at one stage talked of G2. So Chinese know that it is now for them to push their position to reach that G2 level, so that willy-nilly, whoever is the president in the United States will just have no way but to succumb to whatever pressures are exerted by the Chinese leadership.
Indeed. Yeah, that's what it seems like at the moment. But Raviprasad, as far as some of the smaller islands, of the Indian Ocean region itself are concerned, so, islands that Prime Minister Modi desperately tried to reach out to, is that relationship now on hold? Do they need to worry about China? Are they going to go closer towards China going forward now?
I think we need to worry about these equations for the simple reason that if we were to do a statistical study and find out which are the largest trading partners of all the littoral states in the Indian Ocean region, we'll increasingly find China as being number 1 and number 2. That day is not far off when for all the littoral states and the island countries in the Indian Ocean region, China is going to be the number 1 trading partner. Second aspect is China's reaction is to be seen in the light of what has happened in the last decade. Link it up with the US announcement of the pivot and China's what we would term aggression towards the maritime sphere, since China wants to make the transition of being a continental power but with the maritime wherewithal. That is what is happening right now. The other aspect is what can we do about it? If there is a weakness in our planning or implementation, it is that we have been a bit slow on the uptake when it comes to sustaining institutional relations as also constructing relations in the region. The Indian Ocean Rim Association, for instance, needs to be made into it should be a force multiplier for our national interests. And this is where we would need to stitch up deeper bilateral relations with all the littoral in the region. Secondly, we also need to see what China actually is, China's intent is. China has the capability, but what is its intent? Is its intent, as I said earlier, to supplant the United States and the United Kingdom, Diego Garza, or is it to outflank the established powers in the region? That also includes India. China, for one, does it on its own terms. And this would also mean playing the game with established norms in the international system as of now. China has a different interpretation of international law and also maritime law. So how far can China push the envelope, if I might say?
Sure. It's that time of the program where we get final concluding remarks from all my guests. But Pramit, One country that was, extremely alarmed by this development was also Australia, and Australia also has some major stakes in this particular region. You saw several Australian newspapers carry the story as well, and and give it a lot of mileage. So how much of a problem is it really for Australia?
Well, I think countries like Australia and a lot of the Southeast Asian countries are very nervous because they see the escalation of military capacity and, if you watch, even language and rhetoric between the United States and China, to a less extent between India and China as well, as a sign of a breakdown of a relatively organized international structure that existed in the Asia-Pacific or the Indo-Pacific. And they are, if you wish, caught right in between. So a country like Australia is looking at this and saying, do we need to therefore build up our military capacity? But at the same time, when China is now our #1 economic partner, so you have this division, this bipolar problem across all of Southeast Asia and Australia, and the sense that you don't have the regional architecture, that things like ASEAN, which was the core of regional architecture of the diplomacy of this region, is now a hollow shell. ASEAN barely functions because half of its members are essentially pro-Chinese and the other half are pro-American.
Sure.
As a consequence, it's unable to function.
Indeed. Ambassador, your closing comments on the program?
No, I will just mention about Australia also, because Australians, they were counting very much on the Obama pivot to Asia and also on TPP. Now suddenly they are left hanging in the middle, and also last conversation which the Australian Prime Minister had with the US President, I think showed that Australia perhaps doesn't count very much in the US thinking right now when they're thinking of South China Sea. It would be the immediate neighbors and maybe Japan and Korea, which would be of greater importance to contain China. So therefore, what India has to also see in this kind of a situation is to concentrate its attention to all those vulnerable points in India's international relationships.
Indeed.
And we cannot just count on the basis that, yes, Americans are good friends, Europeans are good friends, they would supply us all the weaponry, etc. But that weaponry will take a long time, and it's a question of building our capabilities, having our own infrastructure, our linkages with all the other countries in the region, immediate neighbors, and in the distant neighborhood across the seas.
Fair enough.
So we must build upon that.
And Raviprasad, close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
I would say that we need to gauge China's intent, and for this we need to have a proper high-level dialogue with China on defense issues.
All right. On that note, we'll have to call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Raviprasad, Narayanan, Uday, Bhaskar, Pramit, Chaudhuri and Shashank, thank you so much for joining us on the program, gentlemen. That's all the time we have. Thank you so much for watching. See you again next time.